Strengthen your understanding of governance and policy design. The 12-week graduate course in public policy begins 10th January 2026. Apply by 30th November 2025 to avail a 10% early bird scholarship.
Welcome to All Things Policy, a daily podcast by the Takshashila Institution. We are a bunch of policy nerds based in Bengaluru, and we like bringing fresh perspectives to Indian affairs and Indian perspectives to global affairs. So grab a cup of coffee, sit back, and join us for today's chat.
In just a few days, the Trump administration in its 2.0 avatar would soon complete 1 year in office. But even as the year draws to a close, the ideological contestations unleashed by Trump's MAGA base continue. The latest example is not any domestic measure, but instead an external focused document called the National Security Strategy, or NSS in short. The US NSS, released very recently, sees the world through the MAGA prism. It anoints the primary area of interest as the Western Hemisphere, calls for Europe to regain its civilizational self confidence, and also calls for rebalancing Washington's economic relationship with Beijing. But what does the document mean for India and the Indo Pacific region? Areas that are mentioned in the document, but maybe not in a way that strategists in the region would have liked. To unpack the US NSS and what it means for the world in general and India in particular, I have with me Brigadier Anil Raman, retired, who is a research fellow with the Takshashila Institution. I also have with me Tannmay Kumarr Baid, who is a junior adjunct scholar with the Takshashila Institution. I am Lokendra Sharma, a researcher with the High-Tech Geopolitics program at Takshashila. So let me first start with you, Brigadier. When the document was first released, what was your initial reaction? Were you surprised, or the document broadly fit into what you expected out of the ideological churn that is happening within the US polity?
Well, frankly, Lokinder, my first sense was of shock, because while we were aware of the ideological pillars of MAGA and certain, of course, disruptive actions by President Trump ever since he got elected. But when we saw what this document represented and the kind of way it seeks to shatter the prevailing pillars of the international system, most critically the Western alliance, it was a very, very great surprise. And there was a sense of amazement that, they could inflict so much self-harm.
So, Brigadier, on the India front, right? India is mentioned very few times in the document. And I'm jumping right to the crux of this issue that matters for India. And we'll circle back to what it means for the Western Hemisphere, what it means for Europe, what it means for China at a later stage. But let me just jump right into India and ask you. So, India is mentioned very few times in the document. And I think there's also a mention of Trump negotiating peace between India and Pakistan, something which is bound to irritate New Delhi. And one of the significant mentions of India is as follows, and I quote: "We must continue to improve commercial and other relations with India to encourage New Delhi to contribute to Indo Pacific security, including through continued quadrilateral cooperation with Australia, Japan, and the United States, the Quad." So, how should India read this document? What does it mean for India?
So, if while you do want to circle back later, there are a couple of important highlights of the NSS, which would be useful to understand the proposed India policy. The first one is transactionalism. So, in this national security strategy, the tone is of give and take. Principles have been put aside. It is what can the United States get from a particular country or a particular region, and what can that country give. So that is one thing. The second thing is it approaches strategy through the lens of economic nationalism. So there is economic primacy, and it is economic which drives strategy again, rather than principles or past historic alliances or relationship. The third thing is that there is a very strong cultural come identity aspect of this relationship of their thought process, and this is most clearly seen from the way they approach Europe. In other words, they want to hark back to what they imagine Europe used to be, right? When migration was not there, and when they sort of adhered to their old ideas and ideologies. Now, that in some ways has been applied in the NSS approach towards India. So now, when the United States looks at India, it no longer, there is no language in this which speaks about democracy, common goals, shared values. Nothing is there. It speaks about a possible adversary, China, and it speaks about economics. And the very fact that even in the relationship, it is economics which has been mentioned rather than, military or strategy, that gives us a hint as to the how the Trump administration is looking at India. And for our listeners, I would like to highlight that ever since our relationship changed after the signing of after the agreement on the US India nuclear deal, the focus in the US India relationship was primarily on defense. And we always had issues on economic ties, though there were economic ties, and of course there are people to people ties and so on and so forth. But the aspect of the relationship which really flourished was defense. So with this NSS, which just does not mention defense in at all, and it speaks about economics, what it means is that if our relations are going to be based on that approach, then it is likely that our bilateral relations are going to be even more troublesome.
Brigadier, a quick question, right? I think we can see from the NSS that Trump's America wants to push a contractual relationship towards India, and this is what you spoke about, right? But now let's look at it from India's perspective, right? Does this NSS finally kill the stream of thought that India should try to build, converging values or a deeper alliance with the US? And does this finally establish that India should also do exactly what the US is doing with India and pursue a more contractual relationship? And like the extension to this question would be that whether you see the foundation of NSS 2025 and the entire contractual worldview that US is pushing, do you see this continuing after Trump, or do you see the US coming back to its traditional alliance system after Trump? So how should India look at this?
So let me continue with my, train of thought, and that to an extent will then lead us to a logical approach towards the questions that you have just asked. So, like I mentioned, as far as economics is concerned, economics is likely to take a priority. The second aspect which is mentioned is how Quad, they would continue to support Quad, in which India, of course, plays an important part, because they see it as useful in balancing China. But here again, the economic factor comes in, right? The quadrilateral dialogue has also been seen as the economic primacy of this particular grouping is also mentioned, and they also want the partners such as India to take on more load, that is to be more responsible. This is again a common theme which they are bringing into all the relations, whether it is with India or with Korea or with Japan, and especially so with Europe. So there is no doubt that, to sum up how they look at it, is that they feel that bilateral relations need to be more transactional. The US needs to get more value from it, and the allies need to contribute more. It should not be only the US sort of pulling its weight or paying more than its fair share in this bilateral relationship. So if that is what the NSS speaks about, then we come to the questions which Tannmay has asked. So firstly, To my mind, you're asking whether we should give up our approach of, our sort of ideological foundation or approach when we speak about values, when we speak about ideals with the United States. And it's very interesting that you use the word finally. So I'll come back to that later. The second is that you said, should we respond in the same way? Then thirdly, you asked whether it will continue after Trump. And any more questions did you have on this?
No, I think that was it.
Or the okay. So the first thing I want to make clear is that this is the national security strategy is not a policy blueprint. Okay, it is a thought process. It is a very clear thought process. It is every presidency has to produce it as per the Goldwater-Nichols Act. It is a mandatory document which has to be produced, and it essentially it elaborates on the thought process of the administration, particularly the president. So, and in this document, we can very clearly see President Donald Trump's signature. So, this is what Donald Trump thinks. Now, if you look at the kind of, the mess in which President Donald Trump is in, we are just having the Epstein, case files controversy going on. We have so many other controversies which he's, sort of involved in. And he is facing increasing resistance on large scale within the Republican Party and, of course, from the Democrats. So, how credible are his thoughts? I would put a question mark. We have certainly got a window into his thinking. We have got a window into the MAGA, philosophy. But thinking something and then finally implementing it is entirely different. With the kind of, opposition which is building up to him as such and to his philosophy as such, I am not entirely sure whether, in the remaining part of his presidency, whether he will actually be able to implement this the way he wants to. Also, please keep in mind that much of this is also a performance for his domestic audience, right? He knows that he's undertaken a series of executive actions to show to his base that, look, I've become the president and I'm going to fulfill the mandate. Whether it is actually fulfilled or not is a separate issue. But I think most damagingly for the United States is that world over, there will be people like you who will say that, look, now the US has finally proved, they've, issued in a document in which they're saying that things are going to be transactional. So that is one part of it. Now, whether India should respond in the same manner, I very strongly believe we should not. Because our foreign policy, we are the largest population in the world, and we are not, our values and our thoughts are not bound by what, leader, one eccentric leader chooses to say. Our values and our commitments are far more lasting and long lasting and have a deeper significance than just that. So if you ask, a common Indian whether we should give up our values of, humanity and democracy and so on and so forth, I don't think we would be so shallow. Practically speaking, what it would mean, I'm a person who believes that India benefited far, far more from the United States in the past 25 years than the United States has. Our current society, our current technology, our industry, and the prosperity which we see is basically because of our very deep, commercial and in many ways diplomatic relationship which we've had with the West. That may not be a very popular thought in India. We would rather think that, we somehow did it all on our own. But even at this very time, when there's a H1B crisis going on, why is it a crisis? It's a crisis because we have sent our best over there. Is that the way? If that's the case, then, they have helped us a lot more than we have been able to help them. So in that respect, I don't think that, that what this administration has done is that it has sort of called us out on it. Before this administration came in, you had Ashley Tellis, who was a very strong proponent of US-India ties. He's one of the scholars at the Carnegie Foundation. He was responsible, along with Ambassador Blackwell, for the US-India nuclear deal going through. And he's brought out a series of articles, 2018, 2020, 2022 or 23, in which he highlighted that the goodwill in Washington was running dry on India, because especially after the Ukraine war, there was a lot of sort of questions being asked. Now that's a separate issue. But what I'd like to highlight is that what this administration has done is it has, put all the good feelings aside, and they've come down to saying, what are we going to get for our buck? Are we getting our bang for our buck? So as long as they're there, we can expect this to go on. I don't think it will stop, because just in 2023, we have signed a very major technology agreement in which the US and India are going to, co-jointly develop technology and so on and so forth. I think that will continue, basically because it is profitable for both countries. So our relations will continue with the under the Trump administration. There will be more tensions, may not be as much cooperation, but I certainly think it will continue. Now, what will happen after the Trump presidency? That's 3 years from now. I don't think that I think certainly there will be events and issues in between which will affect the relationship. But at this stage, I don't see the long-term relationship changing. Basically, because it makes perfect systemic sense. If the United States wants to challenge China in Asia, it can't do without India. There's no other choice. It has to have India on its side. And as far as India is concerned, with a declining Russia, with a increasingly adversarial China, and Europe not quite being there as yet, we don't have a choice. While we may try and you know become Atmanirbhan and build up our own capabilities, at least for the next 5 to 10 years, if not more. I don't see us having that kind of you know internal balancing capabilities that we can take on our adversaries. And what was said and done, the US is still the world's largest economy. So I don't think that is going to get affected in any way.
Thanks, Brigadier, for that response. I'll now circle back to Tanmay. And there's one other mention on India in the context of critical minerals, that too. And Tanmay, you have done some work on critical minerals, right? So the document says, and I quote, America should similarly enlist our European and Asian allies and partners, including India, to cement and improve our joint positions in the Western Hemisphere and with regard to critical minerals in Africa. So, Tanmay, what do you make of the focus that the Trump administration has on critical minerals in this document, not just in the particular sentence I just quoted, but also
Right.
elsewhere?
So I think what I'll do is I'll first talk about the NSS and its focus on critical minerals, and then I'll come to what I see as the beginning of of how Trump is planning to actually operationalize this. Right. So broadly on the NSS, I see four things when it comes to critical minerals. Right. Four key themes that it's trying to push. Firstly, it's trying to say that economic security is equal to national security, that the economics matter, and that building resilient supply chains is important. Secondly, it's to reduce dependency, right? And this is the most important part when it comes to critical minerals, because the entire world is really dependent on Chinese overcapacity when it comes to critical minerals and rare earths. And I think with recent Chinese halts on exports, the West and Trump and even India are realizing that having that much dependency on China is not a good thing to have, because China is willing to play the leverage card, right? Thirdly, again, so transactional partnerships is even something we see in critical minerals, right? Because the whole Africa thing, we see that Trump is moving away from, and this is again a very classic Trump thing, that he wants to move away from giving loans and debt and just aid to Africa, to more investing in Africa in such a way that he gets, or America gets, a benefit from it. And fourth is reindustrialization, which is where critical minerals touches NSS again, right? Because that the entire promise of Trump and bringing back in American industry is again where critical minerals plays a crucial role. So given these four things, I think that the way, out of a lot of different policies that Trump is introducing, one of the notable ones that has come out last week is Pax Silica, which is a new document, essentially, that a new framework that Trump has put forward that says that AI, compute, critical minerals, and energy are very core pillars of the new technology race. And protecting these and developing supply chains and comparative advantages in this, along with our partners, is something that America wants to focus on. Right now, I'm going to link back Pax Silica to the NSS, because now it seems like Pax Silica is Trump's way of operationalizing this part of the NSS. Right. So when it comes to economic security, Pax Silica like outlines AI and supply chains and critical minerals in specific as very core security primitives, right? And it says that Pax Silica outright says that reducing dependency on China, on AI, and on critical minerals is the goal. And Pax Silica outlines certain trusted partners, of which, interestingly, India is not in the current list, but we expect India to be added soon enough. And that Pax Silica also says that we need full-scale coordination from minerals to all stages of the supply chain, right? From minerals to processing to manufacturing to fabs, the entire stage of the supply chain. So I think Pax Silica is the way that Trump is bringing forth the theory that he's outlined in NSS. But agreeing to what Brigadier Raman said, right, that Trump is not yet ready to materialize this change, because even Pax Silica, although it is a step forward in pushing what Trump has outlined in NSS 2025, Pax Silica still doesn't give any. It doesn't provide a framework or a concrete grounding on what exactly it's going to do. As of right now, it remains a very vague declaration of sorts that this is something we want to work on, not without telling us what exactly the US is going to do on that, right? So, yeah, I think that's where Trump is coming on critical minerals, and that is the aim for the US in the coming years.
Thanks, Tanmay. Brigadier, before we move towards concluding the conversation, and I remember the very first question I posed you, and after that I went to what it means for India, and I briefly said that we'll circle back to what it means for Western Hemisphere, China, Europe, and so on, and the ideological churn that is happening. And but in your response, you have briefly covered that as well. So I'd like to again, come to those aspects. And you have also recently written in the Hindu about a certain alignment that is there between the G20 restructuring bit, the NSS, and Heritage 2025-2026 document that reveals, according to you, three simultaneous revolutions that are happening in American statecraft. So maybe you can just tell us what these three revolutions are and how do they impact all these different regions that I've mentioned and the globe in general.
Okay. So, to my mind, what is essentially happening is the Trump philosophy is what matters is the United States, and everything else is absolutely secondary, right? So he's cast aside all morality, all values, all sense of justice, and this has sort of manifested in what I call the three revolutions. And if you analyze this NSS through the three revolutions, then everything becomes clear. The first is the fact that, there were three sort of important documents or thoughts which manifested in early December. You had Secretary Marco Rubio speaking about restructuring of the G20. Now, that I feel people have not really paid too much of attention to, but potentially what it has is it's going to again create two tiers of nation states. You're going to have the developed and the rich states, and then you're going to have the poorer and the weaker states. So he is seeking to, and this would mean a loss of all what the liberal international system has evolved over the past 30 to 40 years. It would reduce the gains which was made by doing away with colonialism, because what you're creating is an inner caucus of powerful states which would basically dictate economic policy. And of course, the people who would suffer would be the poorer people, the poorer countries, the conflicted areas, and so on and so forth. This was one. The second is, if you see the kind of dismantling of the moral architecture which has taken place in American public life, all restraint, sort of institutional deference, civic responsibility, everything has been done away with. Shame is no longer, it's just not counted. And all that Trump is looking at is primacy of, power, primacy of the United States, cultural cohesion. And this, when the NSS was released on December 4th, then on December 9th, you had the Heritage taking out a document called the 2025-2026 priorities. Why that is important is much of what is given out in this Heritage document is amplified in the NSS. And the Heritage, which is a conservative think tank in the United States, was also responsible for making the Heritage 2025 project, which was a blueprint for the Trump's administration. And immediately after he became president, all these executive actions and all these actions which he took were taking place as per, Heritage 2025 document. Now, how do I put this together? Basically, the Heritage document is a distillation of the MAGA, doctrine and their thought process, in which the United States primacy is primacy in terms of welfare, in terms of economic gain, is above everything else. They also promote identity over strategy. So the approach towards now Europe and the alliances is there is no common sharing of values. It is about United States having spent or having given much more financially as compared to Europe, and therefore the responsibility, being diluted. That finds expression in which the United States wants to sort of dilute NATO. It promotes Russia. Its policy towards Ukraine has diluted. All this is because they no longer look at alliances as in terms of values. They look at it in terms of identity. So Europe is being punished not only for not contributing enough, but also because it has allowed migrants and refugees and other to come in, and they've changed the character of Europe. On the migrant issue, again, the emphasis which is being placed on anti-migrant operations is because the MAGA feels that the cultural identity of the United States is under threat. Therefore, the primacy is to pull back into the Western Hemisphere where they can guard that. They can guard the homeland. They can guard the domestic. And they can guard the southern border so that the continental United States is preserved. Now, how does that find expression in the NSS? Obviously, the Western Hemisphere, it displaces Europe and the Indo-Pacific as the primary theater. And we hear about this in the form of the Trump corollary to the Monroe Doctrine. I would like to remind our listeners that the Monroe Doctrine, harkens back to 1823, when President Monroe introduced this in order to prevent European countries from intervening in the Americas. But today it is being seen as to prevent it is being seen as the primary theater for American operations, so that the homeland is protected. And who's the homeland protected from? To an extent, yes, Russia and Iran, but mainly to ensure that the migrations don't come into the United States. So, when you put these three sort of revolutions together, the economic revolution of Mr. Rubio's G20 proposal, the sort of foreign policy revolution in which instead of alliances, you're looking at cultural identities, and then finally the sort of moral revolution which is taking place, in which instead of values, you're looking at just sheer transactionalism. then you see how these three have played a fundamental role in changing the United States, United States statecraft. As far as China is concerned, it sort of forms the part where there is less emphasis which is being given to the Indo-Pacific. While the point to note is that there is a certain degree of continuity, but the emphasis has declined quite a bit from what was US policies in the previous years. So it's all about refocusing on the domestic, preventing migration, promoting cultural identity, and then using those as the lens to judge other countries, especially Western Europe. And this sort of weakening of this relations with Western Europe is essentially what do you say, calling into question the entire our current system, international system, which is based on Western liberalism, and a system in which the international stability is being provided by the United States and the West. So those are.
Thanks, Brigadier. I think your response covered quite a lot of ground in the sense that you were not just able to see what commonalities the three different documents had, but also, or the three different things had, but also cover Western Hemisphere, Europe, and China in your response. And thanks, Tannmay, as well, for covering the very important bit about critical minerals. I'm sure there are so many aspects about this document that would require further discussion and further deliberation, including what it says about the state of US polity domestically, because even as this is a national security strategy, they have taken a lot of focus on what should be the state of immigration, what should happen domestically within the US when it comes to certain ideological strands that MAGA has, and so on and so forth. So, but we'll leave that to maybe future conversations. But for now, I'd like to thank you both for helping illuminate what were the key aspects of the NSS and what it means for India. Listeners, if you have any questions, if you found anything you agree with or disagree with, please reach out to us at Takshashila, and we'll be interested in knowing your views as well. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Lokendra. Thank you, Tannmay.
Thank you, Lokendra. Thank you, Brigadier.
If you liked our show, dive into Takshashila's research on technology, strategy, and economic affairs. Check us out at our Twitter handle at Takshashila INST or our website takshashila.org.in.